So this is a high-tech version of our program today. So we've got Adam, who's the CEO of Born Free USA, acting CEO, Born Free International, and the CEO of the Bloody Ivory Project, who is flying around the world and has stopped momentarily somewhere in LA in a hotel, and he's going to Skype in, we think. He's on standby, so he's there.
Hello.
Hello. Good to see you.
You as well.
So, this is Adam Roberts, CEO of Born Free USA, acting CEO of Born Free UK, and he really, obviously, that he works out of Washington, D.C. He is often in London, and right now he is Skyping in with us from LA. So he obviously doesn't just talk the talk when it comes to protecting animals. He walks the walk. So he has established himself over the years as a go-to person for other animal advocates. So I am very happy to present Adam Roberts. Go ahead.
Thank you all very much. Can I just get a hand raised if you can hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you. Sometimes I tend to be loud, actually, so I want to make sure I'm not blaring through the auditorium there. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you all and for your indulgence in allowing me to join you this way. I'm out here in LA for the Performing Animal Welfare Society annual conference, which is on captive exotic wildlife, both elephants and big cats and some other species as well. And I had 2 panel presentations this morning. But since I was able to do this with you all via Skype, I wanted to make sure I didn't lose the opportunity to do this. Although when I told my 10-year-old daughter that this morning I would be presenting in LA in person and with you all via Skype, she said never to again tell her that I'm not capable of being in 2 places at once. So I'm going to do my best for you all and hopefully talk you through a little bit about Born Free's history in wildlife trafficking and elephant ivory in particular. Obviously, I've looked at the agenda for your program today, and it was both impressive and ambitious, and I'm sad that I wasn't able to hear the previous speakers, but obviously you'll forgive me if I repeat anything that's been said, since I don't have the benefit, of course, of having heard it. I did notice, just as an aside before I begin talking about elephants specifically and the poaching issue, that there have been some discussions about wildlife trafficking and the Endangered Species Act. And I think that's not only incredibly important to look at the ways in which the ESA has a very strong historic law on wildlife trade and taking of endangered and threatened species can be implemented, but also a tool that we as animal advocates can use to try and improve the welfare and conservation of wild endangered species. And Born Free USA, along with the Humane Society of the United States and the International Fund for Animals, International Fund for Animal Welfare, just completed a 3-year process of listing the African lion as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. We petitioned for an endangered listing back in March of 2011, and it took 3 years of comment periods and stakeholder workshops before the Fish and Wildlife Service finally issued a threatened listing just last month. And while the threatened listing isn't perhaps as strong as an endangered species listing as we had requested, it's really important in that the lion, which was the last of the big cats not to be listed under the ESA, is now listed, but also that the service proposed, for any of you law students out there, issuing a 4D rule along with the threatened listing, which basically would say that no permit for a trophy hunting specimen from a lion in Africa can be given unless the country of origin is shown to have a robust and sound management program for the species. So this essentially is quite frankly the same as an endangered listing in that the service will have some latitude as to whether or not it lets any trophy imports of lions into the country. And when trophy hunting is taking more than 500 lions a year from American trophy hunters, we think that's an incredibly important achievement. So again, I don't know what was talked about this morning in relation to the ESA and wildlife trafficking, but I do want to make sure that people realize that the ESA is not necessarily some arcane out-of-date law that doesn't have the impact that we would want it to have for conservation. It's actually not only robust, but can be used by those of us who care very deeply about protecting species in the wild where they belong. So with that said, I had been asked to talk about wildlife trafficking as it relates to elephants, the trade in their tusks, and elephant ivory, and I'll do that for a little bit, and if I have time and you're willing, excuse me, I'll just mention a few of the other species that are implicated in wildlife trade, because obviously the wildlife trade does impact a significant number of species that are threatened or endangered. Now, Born Free's history of looking at elephant ivory and the ivory trade is a quarter century long. We've been working on this issue since 1989, and I personally have been working on it since the early 90s, 1994. And most of that policy work is through the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, which, as you all probably already know, listed the African elephant under its Appendix 1 back in 1989, which effectively shut off the commercial international trade in elephant ivory. And of course, this was incredibly important because in the 2 decades leading up to the ivory ban, the elephant population across Africa was fully cut in half, from 1.3 million to approximately 600,000, and that was all to satisfy the primarily Asian demand, especially in China and Japan, for ivory and ivory tusks. And leaders across the world noticed the startling images of African elephants gunned down across Africa, both in the forests in West and Central Africa and in the savannas across East and Southern Africa. Entire families had been wiped out, and as you probably know, elephant families are very strong matriarchal families where you have grandmothers, mothers, granddaughters, aunts, nieces, all living together for their entire lives, which can, of course, in the wild span into their 70s or 80s. And so we were able to show these very profound pictures of these elephants gunned down in the wild, their faces literally sawed away to capture the ivory tusks, which were then exported overseas. And those images were very powerful and persuasive in getting the CITES parties to place elephants on Appendix 1 and stop the ivory trade. Now, what happened as a result of that was pretty astounding, and quite frankly, when we look at conservation history, I think a lesson that we can learn from. First, it became taboo to have ivory because it was known globally to be an illegal wildlife contraband product. And when it became taboo to have ivory, the markets started to dry up for elephant ivory because people didn't want it anymore because it had become taboo. And when the markets started to dry up, the price for ivory started to reduce significantly. And if the price, as we see, started to reduce significantly for a kilo of ivory, then there was less profitability in killing elephants for their tusks. So poaching was reduced dramatically, and as I said earlier, populations were able to stabilize. So what our experience has shown us with the ivory trade specifically is that in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a global, legal, quote-unquote, regulated trade in elephant ivory that enabled the population to be cut in half, and that after elephants were fully protected internationally under CITES, populations stabilized and were given a chance to recover. So we know that strict, unequivocal global protection for species like elephants can help preserve those species in the wild. Now, of course, the southern African countries that wanted to trade in ivory and didn't care about elephant well-being or elephant conservation were obviously relentless in attempts to overturn the ban. They came back to CITES meetings in 1992 and 1994, trying to propose a weakening of the protection for elephants under the convention. And in 1997, the meeting of the Conference of the Parties to CITES was held in Harare, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, under President Mugabe's very dictatorial regime, being one of the countries that wanted to trade in ivory legally once again. So they offered to host the meeting, knowing that they would have home court advantage, and with Botswana and Namibia put in proposals to have a renewed ivory trade. Now, it was really amazing being at that conference as I was in 1997, because when you're in the Harare Sheraton, you're in a situation where everything is governed by Robert Mugabe and his regime. So the local paper, the Harare Herald, was government-owned, and it would be slipped under everyone's door each morning with a massive headline, pro-ivory trade. Mozambique comes out in favor of Zimbabwe's proposal to sell ivory. Japan comes out in favor of Zimbabwe's proposal to take elephant ivory once again. And in the weekend in between the 2 weeks of the meeting, there were buses taking delegates out into the hinterlands of Zimbabwe to look at croplands that had allegedly been destroyed by elephants. And you had these images of farmers trying to eke out a living off the land, having that livelihood destroyed by this proliferation of elephant populations in Zimbabwe, and indeed starving children whose lives were summarily affected, all because Zimbabwe couldn't kill elephants to profit from the ivory trade. And so we had this amazing juxtaposition over the images that we were able to show a decade prior of elephants that were slaughtered brutally and horrifically for their ivory, which held sway in the day, being juxtaposed against the impact of a robust and uncontrolled elephant population at that time. And so seeing that they weren't going to win the day at the end in terms of reopening the ivory trade unequivocally and unfettered, the proposals were amended to allow a very controlled one-off sale of stockpiled elephant ivory from Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe to a CITES-approved trading partner, in this case, Japan. And the theory was that if the governments of those countries have these stockpiles that are operated and managed by the government, and that they control those stockpiles, they could essentially take the ivory tusks, put them in a box, ship them to Japan, have the box opened, and that ivory be used to feed the market, plowing the proceeds from that sale back into conservation of the species in the countries of origin. Now, we know two very important things. I mean, obviously, there are a number of lessons to learn, but the two very important things that we learned from that are, number one, there is no border control in Japan or indeed anywhere in Asia for ivory. The minute that ivory leaves Africa, it can go anywhere in the world. It goes to Japan, it's worked, and it's smuggled to Myanmar, to Thailand, to Laos, to Cambodia, to China, and it can find a market for those products. And in doing so, it stimulates market demand again. Remember, I said that the market demand had dried up 10 years prior. So it stimulates market demand for ivory again, which renews poaching. So that was really the sort of opening of the ivory trade that allowed poachers and ivory profiteers to once again ply their deadly activity. And we started to see from that point increasing levels of elephant poaching and ivory trade once again. Of course, that didn't deter South Africa, Tanzania, Zambia from attempting to add themselves to the list of countries that could sell ivory once again. And indeed, in 2000, South Africa was also given permission to sell off its stockpile of ivory. So where you have a situation at the current day, without getting into all the nuances of the CITES process, is you have Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe's populations of African elephants all downlisted from Appendix 1, meaning no trade that's primarily commercial, to Appendix 2 to allow these one-off stockpile sales. And since then, China, as well as Japan, added as an approved trading partner. Now, because we were able to limit the damage, so to speak, to only these one-off sales, it is obviously much better than an unregulated, massive quota of elephant ivory leaving Africa. But at the end of the day, as I say, the minute you stimulate the market demand, you're going to stimulate poaching. And that's the situation we found ourselves in today, where, according to our research, somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 of Africa's elephants are being poached annually to supply the market for ivory, which I think by all accounts brings us back to the poaching crisis of the 1970s and 1980s. Even the most conservative estimates from the CITES Secretariat suggest that more than 20,000 elephants are being poached every year. So obviously, we are concerned at Born Free that the numbers, no matter how you look at it, are alarming. And I think they're particularly alarming in terms of the trends for elephant poaching across Africa. What we're starting to see is that the very vulnerable elephant populations in the forested areas in West and Central Africa are being targeted. And those are populations that literally could be wiped out. I know that we're often talking about extinction of species in our lifetimes. And I always like to say, when I'm talking about certain campaigns of ours, this animal could go extinct in my daughter's lifetime. But when you look at elephants in Senegal, Sierra Leone, those parts of West and Central Africa, those are populations that could go extinct in my lifetime. So it's really a damaging and very fragile situation at the moment. But also, as we look at the trends in elephant poaching, we're starting to see that it's moving from West and Central Africa through the continent to East Africa, and then ultimately down to Southern Africa, where you do have comparatively robust populations of elephants on the continent. And when you look at a country like Tanzania, which very much wants to renew the ivory trade from its stockpiles, you see a country that is incapable of managing its elephant population. In the Selous Game Reserve in Tanzania, you find that between 2009 and 2013, fully half of the Selous ecosystem's elephants have been wiped out because of poaching. And when you have very high levels of government corruption in the country, which is what our studies have found, it's almost impossible to suggest that a country like Tanzania could have a legal ivory trade and have their elephants protected in perpetuity. So it's really, I think, incumbent upon us at the end of the day to do all we can to try and keep elephants safe from the ivory trade. And of course, we do that in a number of ways, but I told the story of, sort of the pictures of the elephants being killed versus the pictures of starving children to show you how difficult it is for the conservation community to do its work, but also how I think at the end of the day, we have to be rather innovative in the approaches that we take to elephant conservation, trying to stop the ivory trade, so that it's not just a debate between animal advocates or conservationists and those who want to help local people, help communities, and have an ivory trade once again. So what we at Born Free did, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, is we tried to look at the issue from a somewhat innovative and creative way, and that is partnering with defense analysts to look at the issues related to national security and wildlife trafficking in Africa, because we keep hearing more and more in the news how Al-Shabaab is implicated in the ivory trade, and these terrorist factions in Africa are killing elephants and using the ivory to make sales that will allow them to buy guns to ply their deadly trade, which is both against elephants and humans. And so we partnered with this defense analyst group called C4ADS to issue 2 reports on the elephant ivory trade. And when we looked at it, we look at the ivory trade in 3 ways, really. You've got the poaching of elephants, the killing of elephants for their tusks, the supply side of things. You've obviously got Chinese demand, which is driving the trade right now. And when you have that many people with that much wealth available to acquire ivory, it really does put incredible pressure on Africa's elephants and other species as well. So you have the supply side and you have the demand side. And then you also have the link between the two, the shipping routes. How are we getting elephant ivory from Africa to Asia? And so we wanted to look especially at the supply side and the trade routes, because so many people are talking about Asian demand, and everyone knows that the real solution at the end of the day toward protecting Africa's elephants is stopping Chinese demand. However, trying to ingrain that in local communities around China when you have very wealthy businessmen and the highest levels of government in support of the ivory trade is not only a complicated and difficult challenge, but it's also something that could take decades to achieve, and that, in my estimation, is an amount of time that the elephants don't have. So we issued these 2 reports. One is called Ivory's Curse, which I have here, and that's about the poaching side of things. What is happening in places like Kenya, where you have pastoralist communities that are being drawn into poaching because they either want to make money or they're being infiltrated by these nefarious regimes of African criminal syndicates where they know they can profit by selling the ivory that they're able to get in the bush. But you also have an incredible amount of instability being created in places like South Sudan, where you have already fragile elephant populations and already fragile people situations in terms of the instability of governments and local economies, and they're being infiltrated by these terrorist factions. So we wanted to really expose that to say, these are the places, these are the hotspots for elephant poaching and the ivory trade, and that's where international resources, I think, really have to be brought to bear to try and stem the tide of poaching on the ground. And then we issued a second report, which is perhaps in some respects more exciting, and that's Out of Africa. And Out of Africa looks at those trade routes. And this was really, really interesting from my perspective, because it sheds light on the ports of access where, as an export point in Africa, the ivory is leaving. And it's leaving from Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar in Tanzania. It's leaving from Pemba in Mozambique. It's leaving from Mombasa. We're able to really hone down the hot spots, not only for poaching, but for exports of ivory. And if we know where the hot spots for exports of ivory are, it's my sincere hope that people will start to pay attention to those ports of exit and put significant resources there to try and stop ivory from leaving the continent. And what's happening now, which I thought again was really interesting, is you have these 20 to 40 foot long containers, shipping containers, at the ports of export. Each one can carry 20 tons of cargo. And you've got 18 tons of dried seaweed, of shells, stones, cashew nuts, legal products that are leaving the continent. But the shippers are unwittingly having 2 tons of ivory tusks in those same shipments and leaving for sea. So now that we know where these pressure points are and how the profiteers, the traders, are getting the products out of the continent, we really think we can put some pressure on both the shipping companies to do more inspections and also government resources, including investment from the United States government, into stopping those products from leaving the point of exit in Africa. And again, back to my original theory from 1989, if we can stop the product from leaving Africa and it can't get to market, we hope that it's going to stop poachers from killing elephants because they know they can't sell their product on the open market in the end, and therefore they can't profit from the sale of that elephant ivory. And when you're talking about a bush price for ivory that is ultimately marked up 500% by the first point of sale to the collectors in Africa, and then 4,000% by the time it reaches the market in China, you're talking about a price markup that has such a differential that it's no longer going to be of value to the people on the demand side to try and get that product out if it's too hard to do so. So they're going to stop moving in that industry, in the ivory market, because it's no longer profitable. And that, at the end of the day, as I say, I think is going to help elephants. So really, we're trying to look at this in some innovative ways. And quite frankly, it's been hugely exciting for me to do this work, which has just come out in April and in August of this year, because it changes the discussion. It's no longer about animal advocates versus wildlife traders. It's about national security and instability in Africa, places that can't handle any additional instability given the types of issues that they're already facing. And we've had members of the United States Congress, both in the House and the Senate, looking at these reports, having hearings on these issues, which had never really happened before. You've got the Clinton Global Initiative and the President's White House Advisory Council on Wildlife Trafficking, all looking in depth at the ivory trade in a way that they really haven't, at least in the past 20 years. So when you can get reports like these in front of the Secretary of State and indeed in front of the President, I think you're going to have a much better chance of changing the dialogue, reframing the debate in such a way that it'll work to our favor. So obviously this is a huge passion for me and something I'm really dedicated to doing, but I think when we talk about wildlife trafficking, what astounds me is the pressure and the impetus behind talking about it in the construct of elephant poaching in a way that, again, hasn't happened in 20 years, whereas a lot of other species really aren't being talked about in the same way. And so you have an elephant poaching crisis dominating headlines. I mean, it's on CNN, it's on Al Jazeera America. It's really getting some amazing play, which again is terrific for the issue. But there are other species, such as rhinos, that are incredibly imperiled across Africa. And while we may have 423,000 African elephants, we only have 25,000 black and white rhinos left across the continent, and they're being poached en masse for their horn, which of course at one time was being traded to Yemen and places like that to be used in traditional dagger handles, but now increasingly it's going to Vietnam as a folk remedy, completely unproven to cure cancer. And so you have these poor Vietnamese families saving all of their money and spending it on rhino horn to try and literally cure grandma's cancer. And it just doesn't work because rhino horn is like human fingernails. It's made of keratin. So it's a complete sham. But last year, more than 1,000 rhinos were killed in South Africa, the highest number on record, at least in the past 6 or 7 years when we've been looking at these poaching figures. So again, you have a demand that's driving poaching coming from Asia and impacting a species in Africa. We obviously really have to talk about rhinos in the same way that we talk about elephants and the international trade in ivory. Meanwhile, tigers are dwindling in the wild as well. It's estimated that 3,200 tigers remain in all of their wild habitat, whereas 100 years ago, there were 100,000. So from 100,000 to 3,200 in just 1 century, driven by poaching, again, to supply an Asian demand for tiger bone, tiger organs, including the penis, tiger bone wine, skins, claws, teeth, etc. So it's a really dramatic trade, and again, it's that Asian trade that's really driving the demand, and that's leading to the poaching of tigers throughout places like India, which is their last stronghold. And of course, it's kind of embarrassing for me when I talk about this issue in other forums overseas, because we have more tigers in America in captivity than remain in all of the wild throughout the world. So obviously there's something in my mind that's askew in this situation, and I think we have to keep talking about wildlife trafficking in relation to all of these threatened and endangered species if at the end of the day we want to have a measurable impact on trying to save them for future generations. So that, in a nutshell, is the better part of a quarter century of history on elephant ivory trafficking and what's being done today. The next CITES meeting is in 2016 in South Africa, which leaves me very fearful not only for elephants, but again rhinos, because South Africa and the government there has made no bones about the fact that they want to reopen a legal trade in rhino horn using rhinos from captive breeding facilities where they're essentially farmed and the horns are cut off and sold into the trade. And again, the reason I provide all that history and my perspective on it is that we know, full stop, that breeding tigers in China to supply Chinese demand for tiger bone does not do anything to reduce the poaching of wild tigers to supply that same trade. And if anything, it makes it worse because it stimulates demand, and that stimulates poaching. The same holds true for rhino horn. The more we say we're just selling rhino horn from these captive farm facilities, the more you're going to have people out poaching rhinos to get those rhino horn illegally laundered in with illegal shipments and profit from the decimation of the species. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really keep a vigilant eye over this trade and hopefully find ways, positive ways in the future to impact it for the better. So again, I apologize if any of this has already been covered. I think I hit my time, but I'd love to answer any questions that you have, and I remain at your disposal if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a perfect. That was a perfect contribution. Thank you very much for that market perspective. Does anybody have any questions? Sure. Okay, we'll take a couple questions and then we'll let you go. Thank you so much again for being with us here while you're there.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. So my name is Jessica. I'm from Michigan State University, and I had 2 questions. So I'm very interested in conservation crime, and I was wondering if you could speak to, and I'm encountering this in my dissertation, some of the methodology you use to gather data on the illegal trade, so how your kind of research methodology for these reports. And also my main area of interest is Thailand, where, as you probably know, the sale from ivory from captive elephants is legal. And what are your thoughts on why legal domestic markets still persist in Thailand in specific, or if you want to speak to other markets too?
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I would say 2 things in a cursory way, and perhaps we can talk at a later date more in depth about the type of work you're interested in doing and looking at. In terms of the methodology for collecting the information, the short answer is I didn't do any of it. I just turned it all over to the defense analysts at C4ADS and let them run away because they have the expertise, I think, to do that type of work. So when it comes to tracking shipping containers and looking at who's funding the poaching operations, it was all them using both open source data that's available through Palantir, but also digging in with their defense contacts that we, of course, didn't have, to identify as much information as they could bring into the system. One of the things that I'm very proud of in terms of Born Free as an organization is that we liaise with groups on the ground all across Africa and indeed throughout Asia to try and do the work and find out information because, sitting from a desk in Washington or a hotel room in LA, obviously I've got limited resources. So there are groups, for example, based out of Cameroon, the Last Great Ape Organization, or LAGA, and this is all that they do. They look at West and Central Africa and they try and identify who the traders are and work with law enforcement to bust those guys. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is connect the two, sort of connect the guys who are in the field, on the ground, who have the intelligence about who are the poachers, who are the bushmeat, ivory, live animal traders, and put them together with the researchers who have the open source data information about who's actually then moving the product, and create something that we can really sink our teeth into, which is, again, where the excitement comes for me. The other question is about, Thailand, and it's interesting because the last CITES meeting was held in Thailand, in Bangkok, and the Prime Minister had said unequivocally that we're going to be looking at these issues. We know that Thailand's markets are incredibly damaging, but nothing has come of it, and it's not surprising. And I think it's a combination of, I don't want to say corruption because I'm not sure that's the right word with respect to Thailand, but it could be corruption. It could be a lack of willingness at the highest levels of government. It could be a difficulty in the government maintaining power, which is a real problem in Thailand, that the government is constantly on the hot seat. The Congress there, the parliament is being dissolved. So that makes it hard to have any measurable impact. But I think, Jessica, you've hit really the nail on the head in terms of identifying these domestic ivory markets as being hugely problematic. And of course, we have domestic ivory markets in the United States that cause problems. And New York and New Jersey have done great laws recently to stop the sale of elephant ivory. But you've got these domestic ivory markets in China and Japan, in the United States, in Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and indeed in Thailand. And that, again, creates this demand to drive the trade. So I think Thailand is definitely a pressure point, and one that we have to look at, in greater depth.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more question, and then otherwise we will convey all other questions to you. If that's okay.
Sure.
Oh.
Shin, what could we do as an individual?
What can we do as an individual?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. So every time I give a talk, except this time because I got on a roll there and then I felt I better end, but I always say the same thing, and it's hugely important. What happens today in this room is not important. What happens is tomorrow, when you're back home, what you do as a result. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's great that we all get together, share this knowledge. Sometimes we get fired up about the work we're doing. We see images that make us appalled and we want to do something about it. And then we go back to work tomorrow, whether it's at a law firm or even in my own job, and we don't get back into the work that we said we would do and got so inspired to do. So it's incredibly important that we act. So the first thing, which is going to sound like a shameless plug, but I really don't mean it to, is that I would encourage you all to go to my website, to bornfreeusa.org, and just sign up for our Action Alert team. And do it for all the animal groups who are doing this kind of work, international advocacy work, because then every week you're going to find ways that you can send letters to members of Congress. If there's something happening in Connecticut, you can send something to your state legislators. We'll keep you informed of ways that you can act. In terms of right now, if nothing else, I would write letters to your elected officials, both at the state and the federal level, both your United States senators and your member of Congress, and tell them that you demand that in the next session of Congress starting in January, they do all that they can to shut down the ivory trade domestically, not allow any ivory, whether it's in a musical instrument or an antique store, to be sold, because those are laundering opportunities for illegal ivory, but also that America's commitment to saving elephants in the wild be fully funded. So I talked about all the things that we think need to happen. Well, now we need the United States government to appropriate funds during the international appropriations process to have better X-ray technology at the airport in Addis Ababa to make sure ivory isn't leaving the country, have more sniffer dogs at the ports in Mombasa to make sure ivory isn't leaving the country. And that's a measurable way that the United States government can fund things on the ground, both to help wildlife law enforcement in countries of origin for these elephants, but also for the exporting parties to make sure they're not contributing to the ivory trade. So a simple communication from you to a member of Congress will be taken as if it's from 100 of your colleagues, because they know there are other people who feel the way you do but haven't taken the time to write. So I can't overstate the need for you all to take that kind of action and write to your legislators. So I strongly encourage you to do that, and then just to find out more about the work we're doing on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll take one more question.
Excellent.
Hi there. We're so glad to have you. My name's Marta Daniels, and I come from the Deep River, Connecticut area. We have a very special relationship with Ivory in the past. And my question has to do with your reference to the CITES Level 1 and Level 2 categorization. I always understood it to represent the degree of endangerment, physical endangerment in terms of numbers. You cast it slightly differently, and my question is it possible to get elephants under the Category 1, back to Category 1, and what is the impediment to doing that? Either way we cast it, Category 1 is what we want, correct?
That's right. So without wanting to take up more of your time, because I could talk about that question alone for a half an hour, the simplest way to put it is this. CITES is not an endangered species agreement. And the CITES appendices, 1 and 2, there's also a 3, are not endangered species listings. It has nothing to do with that. It's a trade treaty. It just happens to be a trade treaty about wildlife. So species that are put on Appendix 1 of CITES are species that are threatened with extinction and may be impacted by trade. And a species that's put on Appendix 1 cannot have trade that's primarily commercial. So you can have a species on Appendix 1 of CITES that is going alive to zoos or circuses because that's not considered primarily commercial. Trophy hunting is not considered primarily commercial. So you could have species on Appendix 1 where there's a quota for killing those animals and bringing the trophies out of the country. So it's not an endangered species listing. It's a mechanism by which there's a regulation over the international trade in that species. So right now you've got a situation where elephants in Africa are split listed, some on Appendix 1, some on Appendix 2. So that's the sort of general overview of the aspect of categories 1 and 2. The other part of your question is a lot more tricky and unfortunately is political in nature. And the short answer is I don't think we're going to have any luck in moving all of Africa's elephants back on Appendix 1. It's a political hot potato. It's incredibly damaging for Africa when we have a fight over listing, downlisting, allowing trade, not allowing trade. It puts the continent at great peril in the political and diplomatic arena to have that dispute. I think the best thing we hope for is that there are no proposals to allow further ivory trade going forward. Any proposal that we put forward, have Kenya or a friendly party put forward on our behalf to put all elephants back on Appendix 1 is going to make their lives completely difficult, not only leading up to that week conference, but during the meeting itself. And any proposal to downlist further or allow further ivory trade is going to bring contention to the region. So I think politically, though it's not the best answer, I understand, politically I think the only thing we can hope for is that no further proposals to trade in ivory get tabled at future CITES meetings, and essentially there's just a zero quota on international trade as a result.
Thank you. Good answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. And if anybody else has any questions, we will convey them to you, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you so much for being here
Perfect.
while you're in LA.
Good. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.